We are ready to start. This class is called Professional Strategies and New Directions for Austrians. It's a little bit different from the regular classes here at Mises U because this is really much more of an informal discussion than kind of a formal lecture class. And let me give you a little history. Starting many, many years ago in the early days of the Mises University, some of those of us who were currently in graduate school would sit around during the breaks as we were, eating, snacking and drinking beer or whatever, and complain about how miserable our lives were. Not that graduate school isn't a wonderful thing, but, most of us were enrolled in economics PhD programs or master's programs or maybe programs in political science or something where there wasn't a lot of Austrian economics in the curriculum, okay? And so we were feeling a little bit lonely. And of course, remember, this was the dark, dark ages before the internet, if you can believe that people were even alive back then. I once asked Dr. Block if he had, I was asking about his background. I said, did you major in economics when you were an undergraduate? And he said, oh no, he said the only majors that were available when he was in school were hunting and gathering. But we did have economics in my day, and so we would sit around and sort of strategize, okay, how are we going to get jobs once we get our PhD? How are we going to get our PhDs or our master's degrees, number one? And what are we going to do after we get them? What are we going to do for a living? I mean, this might be an issue for those of you considering graduate school. This is one of my favorite cartoons for thinking about career issues. So if you can't read it in the back, it's the cab driver saying to the graduate, don't worry about the real world. I was worried about that when I got my doctorate. So if you don't want to drive a cab, right, you want to be able to do something in your own chosen field of study, right? Most of you guys are here because you have academic interests, you have intellectual interests, and maybe you have thought about having a career in academia. Maybe you want to be a professor one day, or maybe you want to work at a think tank, or be a consultant, or be a journalist, or a speaker, or some kind of a scholar who, works on developing and communicating the kind of ideas that we've been talking about this week. Okay, and I know from talking to you guys that many of you have thought about these things, and some of you are well on your way to pursuing, advanced study in your chosen field. So, what do you do how do you choose a school to go to, and what do you do once you get out of school? In other words, if you want to have an academic career, or a career as some kind of a professional thinker, writer, scholar, intellectual, for lack of a better word, how do you do it? Right? And those of us long, long ago who would sit around and talk about these issues realized that we could learn a lot from exchanging experiences with each other. Right? I mean, you know a lot about your own school or schools, but you don't know as much about what the experiences are like at other schools. Right? And you know something about your own profession if you're working now, but you may not know exactly what things are like in some other profession. And, the grass is always greener, right? So a lot of times we assume that, things will be better when I just get on to the next stage of my career without really knowing that much about it. Okay? And the main lesson, so the point is these kind of bull sessions eventually evolved into a formal meeting where we had a room and a time, basically for people, grad students, undergrads thinking about grad school, professionals who were interested in doing the same kinds of things, just to kind of talk and exchange ideas. What are you doing? What options do you see? What are the pros and cons of trying to go here rather than there? And so we kind of made it into a regular class. But I'm not going to lecture to you. I have 3 or 4 slides with some notes and comments that I've accumulated over the years that I want to share with you. But I want to spend most of the time, I guess we have till 3:45, right? I want to spend most of the time just having a discussion, letting you guys ask questions of me and of each other, and to share experiences that you've had with these kind of academic career-related issues. Now, let me start with a caveat. Many of the examples and illustrations that I'll use will come from my own experience, right? So I'm going to speak often about, graduate school in economics, academic careers, teaching, and so on in economics. But I don't want you to think that what I'm saying applies only to that, right? So hopefully the discussion will be much more general. So if you're, if you're interested in being a writer rather than a professor, or you're in political philosophy and not economics, that's fine. The general outlines of what we talk about should apply to your case as well. And when we get into the Q&A, obviously bring up any issues that are on your mind that are very specific to your own case. But try to think as much as you can in terms of sort of the general problem that all of us face, right? And so I want to stimulate your thinking about career issues in the following way, right? One of the biggest problems that I've discovered in talking to students, talking to young people about these kinds of career issues is, a lot of times people think that, well, what happens to you professionally is just kind of outside of your hands. It's almost kind of random, right? And I meet so many, brilliant students who are researching, 18th century banks in Switzerland, let's say. And they know everything about 18th century banks in Switzerland. And so, well, how do you know about that? Well, I studied. I researched. I read all of the things that have been written about it. I theorized about it. I interviewed people who knew things about it. And I synthesized all that into this great body of knowledge that I have. Oh, and by the way, I want to go to grad school. Where should I go? And I say, well, what kind of research and theorizing have you done about grad school? None. Well, what do you want to be when you grow up? A professor. Well, what have you learned about what it takes to be a professor? Nothing. Right? So people assume that all this stuff just kind of happens and there's nothing you can do to plan. No, it's not like that, right? I mean, you can research and study and think about and plan for things that will happen, medium to long term in your career. Now, obviously that doesn't mean you can plan everything with precision. Right? We live in a world of uncertainty, as some other speakers have emphasized. And there is a lot of serendipity involved in one's professional career as well as your personal life. But at the same time, there is a lot of preparation that you can do. Right? So imagine a diagram, something like this. I think this diagram will be useful to you, not necessarily for the exact details, but for the general picture. All right? So I'm going to use as an example, but only an example, the following situation. Suppose that your goal in life, by the time you're age, whatever, is to be a tenured professor at a university, teaching economics or philosophy or political science or whatever it is you're into. 18th century Swiss banking, okay. That's your goal, is to be a tenured professor. Well, you don't wake up one day and all of a sudden you're a tenured professor. It doesn't happen in one step. Right? There's a sequence of stages that you have to go through before you can get to be a tenured professor. And they're pretty well established stages. They don't vary that much from place to place and school to school and field to field, and everybody has to go through them. What are they? Well, let's think about it. It's useful to start with the objective and work backwards. Okay? So if you want to be a tenured professor, how do you get to be a tenured professor? Well, first you have to be an untenured professor. Right? A professor with a more junior rank before you can get promoted to this professorship with a more senior rank. Well, how does an untenured professor get to be a tenured professor? Well, usually there are certain job requirements. You have to publish books or articles. You have to satisfy other requirements, maybe teaching a certain number of courses or a certain quality of teaching, evaluation scores. Depending on the position, maybe you have to do some public outreach, service, whatever. But, there's certain well-established procedures, requirements that must be met to be promoted from untenured professor to tenured professor. You say, okay, great, I know that. Now, how do I get to be an untenured professor? Well, first you have to have a PhD, right? So you have to earn a PhD and then get a job, an entry-level, junior-level job as a professor. Well, how do you do that? Well, there's a job market. Right? There are established institutions in most fields for sending out applications and getting letters of recommendation and so on. Okay? Well, how do you get a PhD? Well, you have to be a graduate student who completes a dissertation or a thesis. Okay? So what's involved with that? Well, whatever field you're in, a dissertation generally looks like this. It has to be this long. It has these pieces to it and so on. Okay? Well, how do I get to the dissertation stage? Well, first I have to be what's called a PhD candidate. Right? So that's a graduate student in a PhD program who has already taken certain courses, passed certain exams. This varies somewhat from place to place, country to country, department to department. But basically, you have to be an advanced graduate student working on a dissertation. Well, how do I get to be that? Well, first I have to be a beginning graduate student. You see where I'm going with this, right? And you have to complete certain candidates to go from here to here. How do I get to be a graduate student? Maybe now I'm a college senior. Well, I've got to finish college and I've got to apply to grad school and get funding and whatever. Right? The point is, if you're here, you need to be thinking about what this might look like. Where would you like to be at this end of the spectrum? And, you don't just go from here to here in one giant step. You need to think about the incremental steps. Now, you might be saying, but I don't know. I don't know in my field. I want to be the president of a nonprofit organization like the Mises Institute. That's my thing over here. How do I know what the steps are? Well, research, study, look at history, right? Talk to people. Go up to Lou Rockwell or Doug French or Walter Block or whoever is your idol, David Gordon, right? And say, how did you get to be where you are today? And they will tell you. I mean, most people love to talk about themselves, right? They'll be happy to share with you. You can read people's autobiographies. I mean, there's a lot of literature out there that will help you, use the research skills that you have to figure out what the steps will be for your own chosen career path. Okay? So it would be foolish, to get to be a PhD candidate and say, well, I didn't know we had to write a dissertation. Nobody told me that. What am I doing here? I just wasted the last, 3 or 4 years of my life becoming a PhD candidate. Well, that wouldn't be a smart move, right? So try to find out as much as you can about the career path in your chosen field. We can actually generalize just a little bit, right? This is particularly important for those of us who are, for lack of a better word, heterodox. Okay. Now, my claim is not that if you are the ultra-orthodox mainstream person in your field doing everything exactly by the book, you're not going to have any career issues at all. I'm not claiming that. Everybody has to go through the kind of steps in the diagram, but especially if you're interested in a weird, deviant kind of mode of thought like Austrian economics, right? You may face particular career challenges. Not only do you have to be smart and well organized and, a good researcher and so on, but you also have to, in a sense, overcome the fact that the kind of research you're doing is a little out of the mainstream. And it may take some extra convincing or persuasion to get the consumers of your work, people who read your articles, schools that might hire you, professors that might supervise you, whatever, to understand what you're doing and why it's important. Okay? So, what are some things that you can do? Well, in terms of the things on the right-hand side of the spectrum, you say, well, I don't really know what I want to do. Well, I mean, that's normal, especially if you're young, right? But at least you can think about some options. You can think about some possibilities, right? What are some of my life goals? Well, intellectual satisfaction. I enjoy reading Mises and thinking about Mises. That gives me a warm, fuzzy feeling in my heart. Okay, that's a payoff. But I'd also like to get paid. Okay, I also would like to put food on the table. I want to be able to travel, or I want to live in this part of the country. I mean, right? Those are all perfectly legitimate goals, but you need to kind of articulate them as best you can. Think about how you might achieve them, and think like an economist. Consider trade-offs at the margin. Consider trade-offs at the margin. Right? I meet people all the time, graduate students who are trying to get advice on how to get a job as a professor. And they say, well, I'm really open, but I'll only live in Boston. And I think, well, okay, there are some schools in Boston, okay? There's a handful of them, but, have you considered the fact that maybe, the school that most wants you or is the best fit for you or is most desirable to you in other dimensions might actually not be in Boston. It might be in, Topeka. Okay, what if you could get a higher salary or a more intellectually rewarding job in Topeka than in Boston? Would you be willing to trade that off? You say, oh, but my mother's in Boston. Okay, fine. But be aware of the fact that you might have to sacrifice on some other margins, right, to be able to live in the city of your where you want to go. People say, well, I really want to be at a major research university and not a small liberal arts college. I want to research, I don't want to teach. Or maybe the other way around. Maybe I don't want the publish or perish pressure of a research job. I want to teach in a good liberal arts college. Well, there may be different requirements for those. There may be other, the research job might pay more, might have a higher salary, but there's more pressure, right? Teaching at a liberal arts college might pay less, but there might be less pressure. Or conversely, it could go the other way. I mean, there's a lot of, at a good liberal arts college, like many of the ones represented by the faculty here, Grove City College, for example, you have to teach really well. You have to do a really good job in the classroom, invest a lot in students, get high teaching evaluations. At a school like mine, as long as you're not a complete incompetent in the classroom, you're okay. You need to think about that. Be honest about your abilities and interests. You might say, gosh, I'm going to be the next Rothbard. And nothing else in life will satisfy me unless I achieve as much as Rothbard in his career. I can't speak for you, but I know that when I look in the mirror, I know that I don't quite have the same amount between the ears that Rothbard had. Okay, so I have to learn how to be satisfied with whatever I can achieve, knowing that I'm not going to achieve as much as Rothbard did. Okay, or maybe you're a really good public speaker, but you're not very good at quantitative analysis, or vice versa. Right? I mean, take those things into account as well in thinking about what's realistic for you and thinking about these trade-offs. Right? If you like, there's kind of, demand-side considerations and supply-side considerations. There's what you can do and there's what the market wants. And it's the interaction among those that determine, that will influence what happens to you. Okay? And as I said before, how do you find out all these things? Figure it out, right? Read, research, talk to people, ask around, think about it. Don't let things just happen to you. Okay? Don't assume that everything professionally is completely outside your control. A lot of it is within your control, or at least you can try to influence it the best way that you can. Okay? One specific point for those of you who are interested in academia, and again, I think all of this would apply if you want to be in a think tank or write for the New York Times or whatever. But specifically for those of you who are in academia, I think it helps to think in disciplinary terms. And by disciplines, I mean economics, philosophy, political science, history, chemistry, whatever. Okay? So, if you're interested in Austrian economics and you want to do that for a living, to teach it, to research it, remember that you are an economist. What you want to be is an economist, not an Austrian economist. Right, an Austrian economist is a kind of economist. Okay, it's a good kind. Okay, it's the good economist, but basically you're an economist. Right, all of the great Austrians, from Menger to Mises to Hayek, Rothbard, so on, all thought of themselves primarily as economists who were members of the Austrian school. But their research was on economics. They read the literature in economics. They published in journals that are devoted to economics, not exclusively Austrian stuff. Okay? If you want to be if you're in libertarian theory, maybe your field is political philosophy. Libertarian theory is not an academic field. Okay, political philosophy is a field. Or empirical political science, or the history of political thought, or whatever. You need to think in those terms. Those are the people you will be communicating with. Those will be your professional colleagues and associates if you teach, if you research, if you present papers, and so on. Okay? It's important, for that reason, it's important for you to know what are the current modes of discourse. That sounds a little postmodern, but how do people talk in your field? Okay, what do economists, not just Austrians, but economists in general care about? What do they talk about? What are they interested in? What are the issues in philosophy, in history? You need to know what those are. Not that necessarily you yourself are going to specialize in, today's trendy, hyper-specialized interest of the day. Okay, but at least you need to know what those are, because that's what's going to be going on in your chosen field. Okay? Now, I have a couple of comments about some specific issues that may not be relevant for all of you, but I suspect will be relevant for some of you. One of the questions that comes up every year when we have these discussions is, okay, I'm not currently in grad school, but I want to go to grad school. Where should I go? How do I choose a graduate program? Usually I get asked, I want to study Austrian economics. Where do I go to get a master's degree or a PhD degree in Austrian economics? There's one problem with that. There aren't any. Okay, there are lots of places where you can get a higher degree in economics, but there are no places where you can get a degree in Austrian economics. So what do I do? Where do I go? How do I handle that? Well, if you like, there's sort of two generic strategies, which I have cleverly and wittily named Strategy A and Strategy B. Okay. One thing that a lot of young scholars who want to study Austrian economics have done is to try to choose a graduate program. A graduate program where you can study with specific people. So you say, I want to study Austrian business cycle theory, and my hero is Roger Garrison, and I'm going to go to Auburn. Auburn does not at this moment have a PhD in economics. There's PhDs in business, in applied economics, resource economics, but within a few years, the PhD program in economics will probably be back on track. So let's say that Auburn offered a PhD in econ. You say, I want to go study with Roger Garrison. Or, I want to, wherever, I want to go study with so-and-so at this particular school. Maybe there's 2 or 3 individuals you're interested in studying with. That's the strategy that many, many budding Austrians have pursued, right? A lot of students have gone to places like New York University, which for many years had a formalized Austrian sub-program within its regular economics program. And, Israel Kirzner, of course, taught for many years at NYU. He's retired now. Mario Rizzo is still on the faculty. There are some other Austrian economists in the New York area, like Salerno, for example, who participate in a regular weekly colloquium at NYU. But NYU is a mainstream economics department. It's not an Austrian department. There just happen to be some Austrians associated with it. Or George Mason University. Also is not an Austrian economics department, but there are a few faculty and several graduate students interested in Austrian economics who are kind of clustered there. Okay? What are the drawbacks of Strategy A? Well, one, as I mentioned already, there are no pure Austrian programs, at least not within the U.S. There's a slight exception I should make for some European PhD programs. Some of the European programs operate a little bit differently. You don't really take classes. You just go and write a thesis. You just write a dissertation. That's all you do. And if you could find an Austrian to supervise your dissertation, like under Guido Hulsmann at Angers, for example, or Huerta de Soto in Madrid, that's not exactly the same thing as what I'm talking about here. But if you go to a typical U.S. program where you take exams and courses and so on, there's no pure Austrian departments. And most of the places where you could get a PhD and be mentored by or tutored by or take classes from a particular Austrian economist, those are not always the most prestigious universities. Okay, so there aren't any Austrians at present on the faculty at Harvard, MIT, Yale, Stanford, Princeton, Chicago, and so on. If you look at the Business Week rankings or the Economist magazine rankings or whatever of the top PhD programs in economics, those are not the ones where you find Austrians. Okay? Why is that important? Well, academia is all about pedigree. Okay? The academic job market is all about pedigree. It's like breeding dogs. Okay? What I mean by that is there's a general rule. It's not a praxeological certainty, but it's an empirical tendency that there's a strict pecking order and you only get to move down. What I mean by that is if you get your PhD at Harvard, right, then you have a reasonable chance of applying for a job in almost any economics department in the U.S., probably the world, right, because Harvard is ranked very highly. If you get your PhD at the University of Virginia, for example, which is a prestigious program but is not at the very top. It's, sort of in the second tier. Well, if you have a PhD from Virginia, you really can't apply for a teaching job at Harvard because Harvard is ranked higher, right? So you can usually apply for jobs at schools ranked at or below the school where you got your PhD. Okay, if you get your PhD at the University of Missouri or Auburn University, you cannot apply for jobs at Virginia because it's ranked higher. I don't mean that there's a law that you can't, but I'm saying practically speaking, they won't even look at your application. And that's why I say it's like dog breeding. I've been on the employment committee many times at my university and my previous university, but at Missouri, let's say, people apply for an assistant professor job, an entry-level professor job at Missouri. The first thing that people look at is where they got their PhD. If they got their PhD at a school that's ranked lower than Missouri, it goes in the trash. And you think, wait, but okay, I got my PhD at whatever university that's ranked below Missouri, but I'm the smartest person ever to come out of that program. Doesn't matter. They won't look at it by and large. Okay, that's why I say it's like dog breeding. And that's something that stays with you forever. I like sports. And if you look at, U.S. college sports, let's say, if you look at the head football coach at, Notre Dame or Ohio State or something like that, it's very common to find that the head football coach at the top-ranked program, kind of worked his way up. Like he was an assistant coach at a junior college or a high school, but he was very, very good. He was the best among his peers, and he got promoted to being an assistant coach at a medium level, a so-called mid-major. And then maybe he was the best coach ever at, Appalachian State University. Someone here's from Appalachian State, so I was thinking about it. And if you're the best football coach ever at Appalachian State, you might get hired by UNC, or you might get hired by Illinois, and maybe eventually you get hired by Notre Dame or whatever's the top-ranked football program. You prove yourself at every level and get promoted up. Academia is the opposite of that. Okay? Your first job out of grad school is usually the best job you'll ever have. Either you make it there or you don't, in which case you move down the pecking order. Okay? And your whole career, you're always known as a person with a PhD from X. And it doesn't matter what you achieve, you can never sort of go beyond your humble origins. Okay, I'm exaggerating a little bit for dramatic effect, but that's basically true. One of the reasons it's weird is, some degree of this in sports too, but you say, well, suppose I got a PhD from a less prestigious place, but I'm really good, I'm really smart. Can't I publish good articles and write good books and demonstrate, that I'm good and work my way up? Well, the thing is, if you're not already in those elite circles, you won't get invited to the conferences. You won't be invited to submit your papers. When you do submit your articles to the journals, they'll look at the letterhead, they'll look at your affiliation and decide whether to look at it or not. Okay, so it's kind of like, again, this is the idea that you can basically only move down. The reason that's important is, okay, if you get your PhD from Auburn University or University of Missouri or George Mason University or whatever, you're at a disadvantage in the job market relative to people who got their PhD from Yale. Okay? But again, this is an other things equal comparison. Don't get me wrong. I'm not discouraging you from trying to get your PhD at Auburn, Missouri, or George Mason, per se. Right? I'm simply saying that just recognize that other things equal, you are at a job market disadvantage relative to people with degrees from more prestigious institutions. However, you still have to be the best you that you can be. Right? It may be that maybe you could have gotten into Yale, and you could go to Yale, but you'd hate it. Maybe you'd be miserable because you'd be the only one who's interested in your kind of stuff, and you'd be depressed, and maybe you wouldn't be any good anyway. Your research would be terrible. Whereas if you go to Auburn, let's say, you love it and you have a passion and you're with your friends and you write really high quality stuff. So, that's something you have to take into consideration as well. Okay. Also, by the way, there are lots of excellent jobs, outside of the top universities. A lot of people think, it's like, well, if I can't be a professor at Harvard, I'll never be happy in life. Okay, that's like, it's like kids who are playing, basketball and are sure they're going to be in the NBA one day, when in fact only 0.00001% of all, kids playing fifth grade basketball will ever be in the NBA. Okay, So you need to have more realistic objectives, right? And there are lots of great jobs at all kinds of institutions in academia, also in think tanks and institutes and so on, that you can get with a master's degree or a PhD from someplace other than Yale or Harvard. Okay, so don't get me wrong. Now, partly for this, because of the drawbacks of strategy A, some people have tried strategy B, right, which is send out a bazillion applications and go to the highest ranked place that will take you. Okay, so send your application to Missouri and George Mason and Auburn, but also send one to MIT and Chicago and Stanford and roll the dice. Maybe one of those places will take you and you should go there, right? Obviously the potential advantage is that maybe you'll have better job market opportunities. You can get a better job. But there are drawbacks to strategy B too, right? I mean, isolation, maybe you're the only right-thinking person in your department and you're unhappy. There's also what Murray Rothbard called the Superman problem. And that refers to the following. There's Superman, right? That you say, well, I want to do Austrian economics. I want to be the next Rothbard. But I realize that Rothbard's style is a little out of fashion today. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to hide my Austrian interests, pretend that I'm only interested in mainstream stuff so I can get into Harvard. Okay? And while I'm at Harvard, I'll learn all the mainstream stuff. I'll write a mainstream dissertation so I can get my PhD, and then I can do my Austrian stuff. Okay? Right? The problem is that, but let's say you do that, right? So then you're at Harvard and you're doing the mainstream stuff, and you're going to get your PhD, and you say, well, okay, I just want to get a really good job, so I'm just going to hide it a little bit longer. Okay? I'll keep doing the mainstream stuff just enough so I can get a good job, then I'll be an Austrian. But then you get the job and you think, well, remember the diagram, right? Well, I want to get tenure, so I'll hide my Austrianism just until I get tenure, and then I'll be an Austrian. Right? Well, but okay, now I've got tenure, but I want another promotion to the next higher rank. I want to be a full professor. I want to be a chaired professor. I want to be the president of my professional society. I want to win the Nobel Prize, whatever, right? Thinking that finally one day you'll wake up and you will have realized every professional goal. You've reached every professional goal, every accolade you could possibly have. And then, like Superman coming out of the phone booth, you rip off your shirt and there's the big letter A on your stomach. And now, finally, I'm an Austrian. The problem with that, as Rothbard pointed out, is, first of all, you're probably about 52 years old at that point. Okay? You've long forgotten whatever it was about Austrian economics that interested you. You've been doing something else for so long. You've become that other thing. Now you are a mainstream economist. You haven't kept up with the Austrian literature. You haven't gone to the Austrian conferences. You can't you can't flip a switch and all of a sudden become an Austrian. It doesn't work that way. Okay? Sad to say, I have known some very bright people over the years who have fallen victim to precisely this, fallen into this snare. Okay? Where they wanted to be. They were sort of very career-oriented, and they said, someday I'll come back to my passionate Austrian leanings, and they never did. They never came back to it, and they were lost to the movement once and forever. Okay? But as I mentioned before, it's important to keep in mind what empirical researchers call unobserved heterogeneity, meaning each of you is unique in ways that it's not easy to measure. And so the point is not, on average, is it better to go to study with an Austrian person at a lower ranked school or to go to a higher ranked school without an Austrian person? It all depends on you, right? I mean, you may be the kind of person who thrives in one environment and not the other, and it could be either one of these. And you need to think a lot about yourself and realize that what has worked for other people may not necessarily work for you because you're different, okay? As the demotivator for individuality says, realize that you are unique, just like everybody else. Okay. A few other minor issues that come up in these discussions, which I'll mention, then throw it open for questions. Again, if this doesn't apply to you, don't worry about it. People say, what kind of classes should I take to go to grad school? Math, and stat. Lots of math and lots of stat. Almost every economics PhD program in the U.S. requires a bunch of first-year classes that are all math and stat. It's useful to know them. When I was a graduate student, my fellow students who did the best in the first-year courses were often those who had never taken an economics course before, had never had an undergrad econ course, but were physics majors or engineering majors or something. They did great in the first year classes. People like me, I had been an economics major as an undergrad. I really struggled in the first year classes because they were called economics, but there wasn't any economics in them. And, I was trying to, okay, you're saying demand curve, but I don't see anything that looks like a demand curve. And it was a real sort of cognitive dissonance. In fact, I'll just tell you one joke. When I was, I think I was a second-year student, in my program, it was a large program, and a lot of grad students earned money by being teaching assistants, by being TAs in the big undergrad classes. And I noticed that the practice of the department was whenever a grad student was going to be a TA for the very first time, they would always assign them to the intro econ lecture class, principles of economics for undergrads. And I asked one of the faculty members once, I said, I noticed that you always do that, but isn't it, if you've never taught before, wouldn't it be easier for your very first teaching experience to teach, more like a sort of an intermediate level class that's closer to what you actually know? Teaching a brand new teaching an introductory course to brand new students who have never been exposed to the material before is hard. I mean, it takes some skill. It takes some pedagogy. It's easier to do with experience. It's hard for a brand new teacher to teach an intro course. It's easier to teach an intermediate course. He said, oh yeah, I know. He said, the reason we assign all our new graduate students to teach the intro principles course is so they'll learn it. They're mostly math and physics majors. They never had an econ course before. They don't know what supply and demand is. So yet they're getting PhDs in economics. So that just tells you a little bit about those were the successful ones. Notice that, also keep in mind that economics, not just Austrian economics, but all kinds of economics, is often very useful in other fields. So there are economists who specialize in doing history, economists who work in political science departments, economists who teach public policy or law, other kinds of social studies and so on. So keep in mind there may be opportunities to do good Austrian economics outside of economics departments proper. Okay? And if you think about it, I think I might have mentioned this to some of you before, that's kind of what the Marxists did. Right? I mean, the Marxists got booted out of economics departments a generation ago. When I was an undergrad, most prestigious economics departments had one or two token Marxists around. Now they're all gone, right? Does that mean that Marxism disappeared from the universities? No. They just packed up and moved out of the econ department and moved into the English department, the law school, the philosophy department, where they're teaching, Marxist legal theory and Marxist literary criticism and so on. They're still around doing their same Marxist thing. They're just not doing it in economics departments. Maybe Austrians ought to try that strategy too. I mean, there's some people, some of you may have read some of Paul Cantor's writings. He's a literary scholar at UVA who applies Austrian economics, uses Austrian economics to interpret literature, and shows how some important literary works help to illustrate principles of Austrian economics. It's great stuff. In terms of dissertation, keeping up with the literature is important. Not just the formal published literature, but the informal stuff too. What gets discussed on academic blogs and what you hear in coffee room chatter and what people discuss at conferences and so on. Just kind of knowing what's current in the field is very important for positioning your own work. I'll just mention, don't be a perfectionist. Okay, a dissertation is not a magnum opus. Okay, it doesn't have to be the greatest thing you will ever write. It's merely what you have to write to get the darn PhD. Okay, the PhD is like a union card into the profession. So you want to write whatever the minimum dissertation you can write to get the PhD is the one you want, right? Some people get caught up in but my dissertation is going to be the next human action. And if it takes me 25 years to write it, so be it. No, it's not going to work that way, okay? You need to get a job at some point before 25 years are up. Okay, I've already talked longer than I wanted to. We can come back to some of these specific things if necessary, but I want to give you guys a chance to ask questions about things that are important to you, given where you are. And when you ask a question, first explain kind of what you're studying or what you're interested in or whatever. So who wants to go first? Please.
I am an undergraduate student in economics,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm interested in going into a PhD program to study something in academics.
Okay.
My professor told me that if I want to reach for a top school, and per se that I would get into a top school, then he would say it wouldn't be worth it for you to go if they're not going to pay for you. In other words, if you have someone invested in you
Right.
a scholarship. Just wondering what you thought about
Okay.
paying your way or
Right. So the question is about scholarships. Most graduate programs offer some financial assistance to students. So there are two issues here. One is, well, can I afford it? Now, if you're independently wealthy, and Harvard offers you admission into their program but no scholarship, I'd probably go. I mean, but his question though is, do the schools treat people they give scholarships to differently from people they don't give scholarships to? That varies a lot by school. So the school that I went to, the funding model was very informal, and most professors didn't know who was on scholarship and who wasn't. I know there are other programs where the funding is kind of more centralized, and it's almost like a category. Here are our funded students, and here are some guys we let in but didn't fund, and everybody knows who's who. Then that would be more of an issue. So it varies a lot from school to school. Now, in some programs, this is not so much true in business schools or in economics departments in arts and sciences, but it's very true in some other academic fields where particularly in the sciences, where a lot of the research is funded by grants, and graduate student stipends are almost exclusively funded from research grants that particular professors get. So some of you guys might know this. If you're in biology or something, if you're a grad student in biology, you work for one professor, right? Do you guys ever seen that comic strip, PhD Comics? Some people, some of my students send it to me every once in a while. It's kind of funny if you're into weird stuff. But one of the characters is the professor, who is never named, but he's just the professor. He's like this guru figure. And it's something in the hard sciences, chemistry or biology. The professor runs the lab. And then there's a whole army of postdoctoral students and graduate students and undergrads who all work in the lab. And the professor is sort of the leader of this lab. And he controls everything. He controls the funding, the courses and everything. In that kind of a model, it's critically important who the professor is. Right? So you got to choose, the person has to like you. If the professor doesn't like you, then he cuts off your funding, you're gone. Okay? Now, when I was a grad student, my department didn't work that way. So students, there's kind of a matching, it's like an awkward junior high school dance. So at the start of the dance, all the boys are on one side and all the girls are on one side, and they're kind of checking each other out, and there's some mysterious process by which certain pairings take place. My department was kind of like that. So, students could kind of choose which advisors they were interested in, and advisors kind of choose which students, and there's kind of a sorting or a matching process, but it was very informal. Other places do it in a much more formal way, so that's something to ask when you're looking at potential schools. Yes, ma'am. Okay.
I have my undergrad, but it's in kinesiology or exercise science, so I don't have all that math background.
Okay.
I'm willing to obviously do the math if that's what's needed, but what's your take on, for someone who's interested in economic history, not necessarily wanting to go into academia?
Right.
What sort of grad school would I
That's a really good question. One way to address it is, do you really need, what kind of a graduate degree at all do you need? Maybe you don't need a PhD at all. Maybe a master's degree would be, one thing you can do is, pick some people who are currently doing the thing that you're interested in doing and look at their CVs. Do they have PhDs? If so, in what? In history, in economics, what kinds of schools? Maybe they mostly have master's degrees only. It might very well be that going into an MA program or even a PhD program in a history department where you could still take some economics courses would be a better fit if you don't want to go through the process of having to learn a bunch of quantitative skills that you may not use that much. On the other hand, since you have kind of an applied science background, look, mathematical economics, it's meant to look like it's really high math, but it's really not. I mean, mathematicians and, scholars in the natural sciences who do real serious quantitative analysis think that mathematical economists are kind of a joke. It's really not super fancy stuff. So don't be intimidated. You might find it's actually not that hard, and it might be better training to actually go through some of those courses. But again, to somebody, if you decide that, well, for me to succeed in econ grad school, I'm going to have to take 3 semesters of calculus and 2 semesters of stat and linear algebra and these 16 different courses before I can even go to grad school, that's a big investment of your time. I wouldn't make that investment unless you're pretty sure that a PhD in economics from that type of department is a good thing for you to have given what you want to do. And it sounds like it might not be in that case. Yes?
I had first a relevant comment to what you asked, and I have a question for you. But I have a degree in finance from 2002, and I worked professionally in banking, and then I was interested in getting into academia or whatever. And I started taking some of the more math that I missed, and until I found out about this program at Detroit Mercy, that's actually an Austrian MA program, and doesn't require all the math. And then hopefully I'll do a European PhD with Dr. Holzman or something. And so for me, that's what I ran into is I was trying to lay the groundwork to go to a mainstream PhD program, but it wasn't worth it.
Yeah,
I have a family, and it was just too much. And this is just a much quicker way to get there. And I'm interested in economic history too, so the math isn't really as relevant to what I want to do anyway.
Sounds great.
But then I was going to ask you, as far as a dissertation, that's kind of my big block right now is figuring out what I want to do with that.
Right.
And I'm most interested in economic history, but is that as marketable? I've been hearing more that maybe financial economics is kind of the more demand side for dissertations. And so
it's a very good question. I mean, again, there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of variance from place to place. But, right now, the most marketable fields are either things in macroeconomics, financial economics, anything global or international trade, and also particular fields of applied microeconomics like healthcare, environmental economics, maybe some financial and business economics. Economic history, on average, is probably less marketable today. History of economic thought is way below that as one of the least marketable fields, again, on average compared to other fields. But look, I mean, it's just to sort of state the obvious. I mean, this kind of stuff is changing all the time. And, nothing that I've said, none of the specific answers that I'm giving to any of the questions today should be taken as being sort of fixed in stone. I mean, 2 years from now, 5 years ago, the market may be completely different. Also, if you get a PhD from Angers in France or from Madrid, I mean, you may have a different set of opportunities. They may be better, depending on your perspective. A lot of what I'm saying applies to getting jobs in the U.S., but academic universities and colleges outside the U.S. often use different criteria for hiring and promotion and so on. And so if you're interested in or willing to live outside the U.S., or those of you who are from outside the U.S. and want to be in your home country or want to be wherever, be sure and look at the terrain in the places you're interested in going to, because it may be different from the way it is in the U.S. And in fact, it really is in that case. I mean, the Angers PhD and the Madrid PhD, as some of you guys may have heard about from talking to other people here, and the Detroit Mercy MA program as preparation, these are all fantastic, but they're relatively new. And so there isn't a long track record. If you want to say, well, how easy is it to get a job if you have a PhD from University of Michigan? Well, I mean, there's lots and lots of years of history we can look at. There's only a few students so far that have come out of Angers and Juan Carlos and so on, and they're really good students, but I don't know how their careers are going to turn out because it's only been a year or two for most of them. So, yes?
I go to a small college in northern Colorado, but my question really kind of revolves around my economic outlook right now.
Okay.
And this is actually one of the few places argument that, having this humorous bubble, the biggest bubble in history.
Yeah.
Right? And so, when I hear about all of this, academic, climbing the academic ladder, all I'm hearing is tuition, budget cuts.
Right.
They're going to be shutting down buildings.
Right.
Productive stuff that requires no college education. I think there's a higher education bubble itself. Too many people getting involved with higher education, with misallocation of resources, essentially.
Right.
And, I think that's really has to play into it, because we're going to have all these, I don't want to call them useless degrees, but I'm sure a great portion will.
Oh, sure. And there is a PhD glut as well as an MA glut and a bachelor's degree glut in numerous fields, and that's something to think about for sure.
Right now I'm thinking I'm studying history, and I'm only a sophomore. I'm studying history and political science, but I'm thinking of switching and going to nursing school just because it's practical.
Yeah.
But I still have the passion for
right. No, absolutely. But that goes back to what we were talking about at the very beginning. I mean, you've just given an excellent illustration of the right way to think about these trade-offs. Right? I mean, again, doing one's own market research. You may think, look, I really have a passion for Austrian economics, but I think my employment opportunities are not going to be very good there. And if I study nursing or engineering or whatever it might be, I have a better chance of getting a job, but I realize I might not have as much free time. I might have not the opportunity to pursue this passion. Well, I mean, only you can decide based on your own preferences how you want to try to manage that trade-off. But I do have a comment on your thing about the bubble. I mean, I agree with you with one caveat. I mean, I think there is massive overinvestment, malinvestment in an Austrian sense in higher education. My only disagreement with you, it's not a bubble like something that just started. It's been going on for decades, indeed centuries. Right? The higher ed establishment is vastly larger than it would be on the free market for one, obvious reason. Massive government subsidies, massive government intervention. I mean, the higher ed sector is totally, even where it's nominally private, it's de facto nationalized, right? So, of course, it's much bigger and much more wasteful and less efficient and corrupt and so on than it otherwise would be. Now, how should you take that into account in thinking about the things you're doing? Well, one question, is the bubble going to burst? Or this thing that's not really a bubble but a secular. I mean, someday it will, but I don't know when. There's a lot of inertia in higher ed. My suspicion is, there are a lot of budget crises that you hear about now, and some universities are putting professors on furlough, and they're cutting back budgets, and they're raising tuitions. My sense is that is a big disruption right now. I don't know that that's enough to be the death knell of higher ed. Someday, I predict that the house of cards will tumble, and what we'll be left with, this is all conjecture, but I think kind of more of a long-run equilibrium, if you like, would be a much smaller higher ed sector with a few kind of elite schools where the wealthy who want to learn Greek and Latin or whatever will go. A lot of vocational schools, trade schools essentially, that teach pragmatic, useful economic skills, but that eliminates the vast majority of four-year colleges and universities, which are teaching, postmodern literature or whatever. And that would all be gone. And then a lot of the content would be delivered not through four-year colleges and universities, but through alternative channels. The Mises Academy, for example, for-profit institutions, non-profits, small programs, short programs. There'd be a lot more variety. But how long will it take to get there? It might not be my lifetime or your lifetime. It might be our grandchildren, great-grandchildren, but it might be tomorrow. I just don't know. Yeah, you had a follow-up.
Yeah, and if I may, I don't want to make this really long, but one other slightly unrelated thing. I think what our entire movement needs the most is going to be propaganda, public relations, and media, and not to bring up like Glenn Beck, but that kind of thing, something that's just presenting,
right?
Presenting the ideas in a way that's marketable to everyone. So I think that's something all of us should consider.
Great. Let me just stop you. We only have 2 or 3 minutes left. Let's try to get 1 or 2 more people in. Who has not asked a question yet? Right.
Would you talk about publication strategy?
Really that's, again, the general lesson is it varies from discipline to discipline and school to school, so think about it. Right, one issue, to be at research universities, the number one criterion for promotion from assistant professor to a higher ranked professor is publications. Publications in refereed academic journals. At some schools, the number of publications is more important. At other schools, the rank of the journals in which you publish is more important.
Would you talk about that specifically, like journal ranking of peer-reviewed journals?
Yeah, but you can just go look it up. It's easy to find. There's a lot of places you can find out which journals are the highest ranked. At some schools, unless you have at least 3 publications in a journal in a particular ranked category, you won't get tenure no matter what else you do. Other schools don't use use more looser criteria.
Is what you're talking about ranking applied journals? Is it easy to move up if you publish in lower ranked journals to higher ranked journals?
Right. No, generally not. With a few exceptions, unless you're really well known in a particular field. The people who publish in the highest ranked journals are often young people who have just come out of the highest ranked programs and have been trained specifically how to hit those journals.
I'm an undergraduate right now in economics math, and I'm minoring in appropriate technology, and I just want to know, I'm trying to do the right things to get into graduate school, but how do you get them to look at your application if you're from a not so well-known?
Okay, the good question is it possible to get into a prestigious graduate program if you come from a less prestigious undergraduate program? This whole pedigree thing that I'm talking about, it really only starts once you're in grad school. So if you look at the people who get into, grad students at MIT or something, a lot of them come from all kinds of schools, large and small. So how do you get into grad school in economics? There's one primary criterion, and that's math GRE score. You think I'm kidding, but I'm not. Whether you were an economics major, doesn't matter. How many economics courses you took, doesn't really matter. Verbal GRE score, doesn't matter. Economics subject test GRE score, doesn't matter. The quality, prestige of your undergraduate college doesn't really matter much. Your undergraduate grades hardly matter at all. The essay that you write, don't spend more than 5 minutes on it. They won't even read it. Math GRE score is the most important criterion. If you have a high math GRE score, Harvard and MIT will look at you.
Well, I went to, I guess Duke would probably be like a second tier school, right? So their requirements for GRE, they said like 790 and up.
Yeah.
So,
well, again,
get into a school better than...
Fine. Look, but they may look at other things too, right? So lots of different schools if a school posts specific requirements on its webpage, you must be in this percentile on the GRE, you must have this undergrad GPA, whatever. Obviously that's something that you need to know that, but by and large, it's mathematical aptitude is the thing they care most about, because studies have shown that's the best predictor of success in the first and second year courses in econ PhD programs. Okay, we're out of time, so let's stop here, but